what hospital she was at and what years. Be interesting if they knew each other somehow.
Yeah.
In between hospitals.
Right, we are live.
All right. Welcome to Medieval Times. It says here part 3. That just means we're in the third section of the Middle Ages, which is the last section. And we're towards the end of that part of the Middle Ages, the medieval times. Let's ask God to bless our time as we're looking at a lot of confusing things tonight. And you say, what else is new? Every week it's confusing one way or another. Lord, we thank you that we have records of history because they are records of what you're doing, of how you're carrying out your plan. And as we are moving quickly toward the things that maybe we're more interested in, we pray you'd help us to be aware of what's happening in the time period we're looking at, so that we can see how you are working there in order to bring those important things about. We thank you for those in every age who you have called out to yourself to be a witness of who you are. We thank you for how you always have someone who is testifying to the truth. And may we each be those someones in our own age as well. We pray your blessing upon our time, and may you be glorified in what we are learning and how we approach what we're learning. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, last time we looked at this chart, and we're seeing all the things that were occurring in relationship to the papal schism, how we at one point, because of the different political circumstances primarily, we ended up with 2 popes, and then to remedy that, there became a 3rd pope, and so now we've got 3 popes. And if you don't know what that's all about, then get on YouTube to Floyd Village Baptist Church and look up last week. But in the midst of all of that, you're looking at these 2 sides of what's going on in the church. We had the 100 Years' War. And so what we're going to be looking at tonight is taking place at about the same time, or overlapping at least, with what we were looking at last week. It's just too hard to try to do it all at once. So tonight we're going to be looking at what I'm calling the emergence of national states, because through this process of what's happening in the church and outside the church, the idea of a national state is going to develop, and we'll see that occurring. It's already been occurring. As if you've been with us, you've seen it. Different people begin to congeal, and nations begin to form. But it's going to take on a greater degree as we look at what tonight and probably next week is. I said we would cover the 100 Years' War in an hour tonight. I have no idea whether we'll be able to do that or not. I'm hoping that we can. But even after the 100 Years' War, there's some other things that are occurring in Europe that help to develop nations as well. So we'll get into that probably next week. So tonight, the main topic is the 100 Years' War. And as you notice, whoever came up with this slide is calling it the age or the end of chivalry. You'll see why. Now, to understand the causes of the 100 Years' War, if you've been with me very long at all, you know that there's nothing that's caused by just one thing. And there's nothing that's caused by just the things that happened prior to the thing that's being caused. You have to keep going back. It's the same thing in Scripture. You look at the context of Scripture. It's great to look at the verse before the verse you're looking at, but usually you got to look back further than that to get the flow of context. Well, that's true in looking at historical events like this. So when we consider the causes of the 100 Years' War, we have to really go back at least to 1066. I hope that's a date that resonates in your minds of when William the Conqueror crossed the English Channel and defeated a rival for the throne of England. And so we have a Norman ascending to the throne of England. And so being that he was Norman and still had control over parts of France, from then on, the King of England would own parts of France as well as being in charge of England. And then we move forward about 100 years to when King Henry II married Eleanor of Aquitaine. Aquitaine is a section, a region of France. And so she brings some of France under her control as well. And what makes it even more interesting is she's the former wife of the French king. So there's all that kind of stuff going on too. And I would suggest you go back and find whatever episode it is that we dealt with all of that. Very interesting period. If you haven't looked at that, it's when you've got King Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and then their children are Richard the Lionheart and John, and all the dynamics of going on then. So Henry at that point received a lot of French land. So as a result of that, a large part of the history up until this point, there are English holdings in France that present a recurrent source of conflict between the kings of France and England. In fact, there are times, somewhat prior to this, centuries prior to this, where the King of England actually owns more land in France than the King of France does. And so there's this ongoing conflict between the two. This map, and it's kind of hard to see. Well, actually, you can see it better than I can. The English are in control of, at some point in time, of the kind of pinkish areas, and France is divided up into different people being in control. You can see the blue is easiest to see. The Kingdom of France is the outline in blue, that whole thing. But the royal domain of the French king is only what's in dark blue. The lighter blue are possessions of the court of Toulouse. And so France is kind of all divided up. And so sometimes the English kings want to get a part of that. So the immediate precipitation of conflict is when the French king Charles IV dies in 1328 without an heir. Let's see, I think I'm getting ahead of myself maybe a little bit. Go back to, okay, during this time, Francis Philip II had greatly reduced England's territories to only the Duchy of Aquitaine, which is down here. This area is the Duchy of Aquitaine, which is what Eleanor had brought with her when marrying Henry II of England. And so Philip II of France had eliminated English control over everything except that. But when he attempted to obtain the rich commercial territory of Flanders, which is up there, the upper right, you see where it says the County of Flanders. You may be familiar with World War I. That was a famous area in Flanders Field, the poppies grow. Famous painting made of that is at the Butler in Youngstown. He attempted to grab that area because it was an area that participated in a lot of trade. They had a lot of seaports there in Flanders, and especially the wool industry. the seaports there were heavily involved in the wool industry, which affected England. England produced a lot of wool. And so France is trying to get a hold of, or Philip II is trying to get a hold of that area. That's going to greatly affect then English commercial ventures, especially in wool. The Capetian family, that is those descendants from Hugh Capet, which we talked about a long time ago, had ruled France since Hugh Capet in 987. In 1327, Charles helped his sister Isabella against her husband, King Edward II of England. During his 6-year reign, Charles IV increased taxes, imposed onerous duties, and arbitrarily confiscated estates from enemies of those he disliked. So Charles IV is not a very popular guy, not a very nice guy. So he's the one then that dies in 1328 at the age of 34 without an heir. So at this point, the Capetian dynasty, the family of Capet, who had been ruling France since 987, is in a crisis because there is no obvious successor to the throne. You can understand that. When you've got a monarchy, you've got a king, the king's son takes over. Well, what if the king has no son? Okay, now what are we going to do? And that's happened a lot of times throughout history, and this is one of those times. There was a daughter of Charles IV, and another child coming from his pregnant widow, but the Estates General, that is the nobles that had gotten together and formed a kind of parliament, had decided 12 years previously that no woman could inherit the throne of France. So because they've already made that decision, they can't go to Charles IV's daughter and put her on the throne. Well, at this point then, the English king, Edward III, who had become king of England at the age of 14 in 1327, seized the opportunity to attempt a seizure of control, being the closest male relative of Charles IV. There's a lot of intermarriage between the two nations, the rulers of those two nations. And so he sees an opportunity maybe to worm his way into being king of France as well as England, because he's the closest male heir to Charles IV. He derived his claim through his mother Isabella, who was the sister of the recently departed Charles IV. Edward III of England declared himself king of France in a ceremony in Ghent in January 1340, showing off his newly quartered coat of arms. In other words, he has 4 parts now, including the 3 lions of the Plantagenets. You might recognize the lions from the Plantagenet line. And now includes the golden fleur-de-lis of France. So his new shield has all of that, indicating that he is king of both England and France. Another also laid claim to the newly vacated throne. His name is Philip, the Count of Valois, and nephew of King Philip IV, who had been a previous king before Charles IV. An assembly of magnates decided in favor of the one who would be known as King Philip VI. So they decided this nephew, this relative in France, was better than the relative in England, who is also King of England. In addition, the laws regarding succession were reinterpreted to not only exclude a woman from ascending to the throne, but anyone whose inheritance came through a woman, which would mean Edward III of England. But anyone whose inheritance came, okay, no, I already said that. The rivalry between these two rulers then would result in the 100 Years' War, beginning in 1337, in part precipitated by the seizure of Aquitaine by Philip VI. So going back, remember the area of Aquitaine, Philip, this new king of France, Philip VI, decides, okay, we're going to get all of France under the rule of the French king, and that leads to conflict. Okay, all that clear as mud, but at least you know that there's a reason for it, even if you can't follow all of it. All right, there are some French advantages that we should take note. Their population is much larger than England. They're richer than England. At one point, they fielded an army of over 50,000, whereas England could only come up with 32,000. So the French possessed more wealth and population. France was at the height of its medieval glory and had the early advantage. Early naval victories appeared to clear the way to an assault of England proper. So France is preparing to invade England. But the English had some allies, the Dutch and Bavaria, part of Germany. And in 1340, Edward forced Flanders to recognize him as king by imposing a wool embargo. If you don't recognize me, we're not going to export wool to you, through you anymore, and that would affect the Flanders merchants. After an unsuccessful invasion through Flanders, Edward invaded Normandy in 1346 and seized Calais. Well, I should mention that a French invasion fleet did attempt to go to England in 1340, and they were annihilated by the English. And so that ended in a prospect of an invasion of England. And as we just said here, Edward III then invaded France for the purposes of protecting international trade, they said. They were able, through the invasion, to win some booty and estates for the nobles of England and reacquire Aquitaine. The English invaded Normandy, and they used the strategy, and excuse my French, and I don't mean I'm going to swear, I just don't know how to say these French words. If any of you are French and know, you will be offended at my pronunciation, and if so, you can tell me how to say it correctly. It looks like Chevanches. That ring a bell with anybody? No, okay. Which basically were acts of terrorism. They were designed to strike terror into local populations by burning crops, raiding their stocks, and permitting general looting in the hope of drawing the French king into open battle. So in other words, they're going through the countryside doing everything they can to provoke the French king to come out and fight. The strategy worked, and the English were able to win several victories over the French at Crécy in 1346, at Poitiers in 1356, and at Agincourt in 1415. Now, just to give us a summary of what takes place, we're going to watch a short video, and then hopefully that'll give us a framework by which we can go through and look at the details.
1337, and Edward III has just had his French lands confiscated. Normally, such a conflict would be resolved by an English king acknowledging that they held these lands as a subject of the French king. Well, not this time. Edward III would try the different tactic of declaring himself to be the rightful king of France instead. His claim came via his mother, Isabella, which the French dismissed because inheritance wasn't matrilineal. Naturally, Edward's claim meant the beginning of a war, the 100 Years' War. Couple of quick facts. First, the war actually lasted for 116 years. And second, the war wasn't continuous, and there were many years of peace between the three main phases of the war. So at first, Edward struggled to raise the money for an invasion, and so had to delay any military action until 1340, the year he formally declared himself the King of France. This year saw the first major battle of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Sluys. This battle involved the English requisitioning merchant ships and outfitting them for war. These ships then sailed for the French navy stationed at Sluys. The result was the destruction of the French fleet in England securing the Channel. After this, Edward landed in France, but nothing much really happened on either side because war is expensive and no one could afford it. A truce was declared, but it didn't last due to the death of the Duke of Brittany in 1341. Brittany was semi-independent of France, and both sides backed rival claimants to the duchy. Edward landed there in 1342 and took this land before another truce was signed the next year. Negotiations towards a permanent peace between England and France broke down, mostly because Edward didn't want peace. In 1345, the war resumed, but the English weren't very successful, barring some victories in Gascony. The next year saw the main English thrust when Edward took a large army and landed here in Normandy. Edward's advance was not meant to capture and hold land, but was instead what is called a chevauchée, which is when an invading army essentially set everything on fire. Edward moved north before King Philippe's much larger army caught up to him, and the two sides clashed at the Battle of Crécy. Crécy was not only a surprising English victory, but it was a decisive one, seeing many French nobles and the King of Bohemia killed in hails of arrows from English and Welsh longbowmen. After this victory, Edward marched north and laid siege to Calais, capturing it the next year. Calais was an extremely important gain for Edward because it provided a gateway into France at the shortest crossing point from England, making future campaigns cheaper. English good fortune wasn't limited to France, as the King of Scotland, who had been at war with England since 1332, was captured by the Archbishop of York at the Battle of Neville's Cross, just outside of Durham. The feeling of celebration would be cut short by the introduction of the Black Death in 1348, which was kind of terrible. The destruction wrought by the plague meant that no major military campaigns could be undertaken by either side for many years. In 1350, King...
And we covered the plague months ago because we had to cover the plague, the whole thing, but it's over a long period of time and it keeps interrupting what's going on in different places. So we have seen different time to time, oh, but then the plague struck. And this is another one of those times when the plague has one of its resurgences.
Philip died and was succeeded by his son, King John II. There was some skirmishing and piracy over the coming years, and both sides tried to sue for peace, but neither could agree on Edward owing homage. In 1355, Edward, the Prince of Wales, better known as the Black Prince due to the armour he wore, launched a devastating chevauchée and decimated French lands. He was confronted by King John, who had a much larger army, at Poitiers in 1356. The battle here is one of the most famous English victories in history, mostly because the French king was captured, thus continuing the long streak of kings who were called John being terrible. Capturing King John was a huge bonus for the English, and the ransom demanded was huge. French luck worsened when the country descended into civil war, and rioting meant that King John's ransom couldn't be paid, thus invasion. In the end, the French agreed to the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which ended the first phase of the war, called the Edwardian phase. This treaty gave Edward all of this land in return for Edward dropping his claim to the throne and lowering John's ransom. King John would never be released, since in 1364 he died in London and was succeeded by his son Charles V. Peace between England and France would be broken in 1369 when King Charles called the Black Prince, now the Prince of Aquitaine, to Paris. The prince refused, and so war. Under Charles, the French did much better, with an early victory in 1370 at Pont-Vaillant. Shortly after this, the Black Prince became Manuel and returned to England in 1372. This second phase of the war, called the Caroline phase, saw the English territories reduced from this to this by 1376. This year also saw the Black Prince die, and the next one, Edward III, died as well. The throne passed to Edward's grandson, who was crowned Richard II at the age of 10. 3 years after this, Charles V of France died and was succeeded by Charles VI, who was only 11. So having 2 children ruling 2 kingdoms at war was not a recipe for stability. Many nobles vied for dominance over the new monarchs, but in England, Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt, acted as a stabilising force. Gaunt was an accomplished general and was also married to the daughter of the King of Castile, through whom he claimed its throne. He attempted to take up his claim in 1381 with the help of the Portuguese, whom England had made an alliance with in 1373, which was confirmed by the Treaty of Windsor. Incidentally, this treaty is still in effect today, making it the oldest active alliance in the world. Ultimately, John of Gaunt was unsuccessful in taking the Castilian throne, and by 1389 he was back in England. Political divisions, along with the financial pressures of war, meant that Richard II made peace with the French, which would last for the rest of his reign. Richard's reign was consistently plagued with issues surrounding his nobility, who had stripped him of significant power. France also had issues with King Charles VI, who was prone to bouts of madness. Because of Charles's condition, a regency was established, which led to a power struggle between the Duke of Burgundy, who controlled these lands, and the Duke of Orleans, who controlled these. Back in England, Richard was regaining some of his lost powers and ended up exiling John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, in 1398. The next year, Gaunt died, and Richard disinherited Henry, which was a bad idea. Henry returned to England to reclaim his seized lands. Most of the English nobility sided with him, and Richard was overthrown. There was some debate over who would succeed Richard, but ultimately Henry succeeded him as Henry IV, the first monarch of the House of Lancaster. But as far as the 100 Years' War was concerned, Henry wasn't very important. Suffice to say that there was some fighting, but it was sparse, and also the English kept losing despite the civil war in France. Henry IV died in 1413 and was succeeded by his son, Henry V, who was one of England's most famous kings. Henry was willing to make peace with the French, providing they gave him this land. Shockingly, they said no, and so war it was. In 1415, Henry landed in Normandy and seized Harfleur before moving north to Calais. Before he got there, Henry was cut off by the French army and they clashed. This battle, the Battle of Agincourt, is known for being one of England's greatest military victories. The English were heavily outnumbered, but Henry's army was 80% longbowmen. The French casualties were massive, and the French nobility was devastated by the deaths and imprisonment of many of France's leading officers. Henry didn't continue his campaign afterwards and sailed back to England with his hostages. Henry returned to France in 1417, this time setting out to conquer France entirely and have himself crowned king. Because France was still undergoing civil strife, the English were able to capture most of Normandy except for Rouen, which fell in 1419. 1419 was an important year in the war because it saw the Duke of Burgundy assassinated on the orders of the French heir, the Dauphin of France. The Duke's successor, Philippe, sided with the English and declared his support for Henry as the King of France, along with many other French nobles. This was the final nail in the coffin for the French and resulted in the 1420 Treaty of Troyes. This stated that Henry was to be the regent and heir to the French throne, that Charles's children were to be disinherited, and that Henry would marry Charles's daughter, whom he had one son with in 1421, also called Henry. Not all of the French accepted Henry as king, and resistance to him continued, with both the English and French winning victories. Henry was not just a conqueror and managed to overcome many challenges at home. One such challenge was the Southampton plot. This saw several nobles attempt to overthrow Henry and replace him with Edmund Mortimer, a cousin of Richard II. This plot was foiled before it could begin in earnest, although they would have had trouble anyway, since Mortimer didn't want to be king. Henry also made great efforts to increase the use of the English language in government. Another issue which Henry V had to deal with was the continuing rise of Lollardy, a religious movement which disliked the church as an institution. Henry saw Lollardy as a threat to stability, and so found a clever way of stopping Lollards from continuing their.
He's saying Lollards, Lollards. Those are the followers of William Wycliffe, whom we will get to not too far in the future.
Protests, burning them alive. John Oldcastle is the most notable of those burned, since he was an old friend of Henry's. Henry returned to France to strengthen his position in 1421, and it was there that he suddenly died of disease the following year. 2 months later, Charles VI died, and so the infant Henry VI was supposed to be crowned the King of France as well. In 1428, in an attempt to crush dissenters, the English laid siege to Orleans, but the defenders were relieved the next year by an army which was special for one simple reason: it was partially led by a woman. This woman was Joan of Arc, commonly known as the Maid. The English were soon after crushed at the Battle of Patay, and many French nobles switched allegiance to the Dauphin, who was soon after crowned King Charles VII. In 1430, Joan of Arc was captured by the Burgundians and handed over to the English. Since she had claimed to receive visions from God, she was tried as a heretic, and in 1431 she was burned at the stake. In 1435, the Pope attempted to bring the war to an end, but both sides refused. What did happen during the negotiations was that the Duke of Burgundy made amends with Charles VII. Thus, England's most important ally had deserted, making the French significantly more powerful. After this, the French recovered the initiative and recaptured large swathes of land. In 1444, a truce was signed which was supposed to last until 1450. However, the English broke the truce in 1449 by launching a military action in Brittany. This gave the French the excuse they needed, and the next year they retook Normandy and shortly afterwards crushed the last English army at the Battle of Formigny. All that remained now was Gascony and Calais, and the former would not last much longer. The killing blow came in 1453 when an English army was destroyed at the Battle of Castillon. This was mostly due to the advancements in the use of gunpowder weapons and superior French tactics. For many historians, Castillon marks the end of the 100 Years' War, but be aware no treaty was signed in its immediate aftermath. England's territories had gone from this to this and back to this in 116 years. All that remained was Calais and the Channel Islands. The reason why this is often considered the end of the war was that there was no longer any realistic chance of England retaking France. The ambition to do so would, however, remain until the 19th century. The 100 Years' War has many important legacies. It fostered a sense of English identity, one centered on the English language, which began to replace French as the language of the ruling class. Whilst the French victory did not kill off any English ambitions for the lands in France, it does mark the point at which England starts to be viewed as an island nation. The 100 Years' War also marks a period of immense restraint by the French, who managed to go this entire period without naming a single king Louis. But much like the peace, this wouldn't last. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. There are some books in the description below if you'd like.
All right, that was a quick run. That was 10 minutes through the 100 Years' War, and we're going to do it in an hour maybe. And I'm not going to really cover some of the things that they did. We're looking at a few different things. Going back to Edward III, he landed in Normandy in 1346, and he started to go towards Paris. But then he thought better of it, and instead began moving his troops to the north, where he hoped to join with his allies in Flanders, and that area of Flanders. However, French troops caught up with with the English near the village of Créchy, about 100 miles north of Paris. Here is a diagram of how the battle begins to form. You see the French in blue and the English in red. The different parts of different sections of their army. You can see that the English especially is going to be especially important. The sort of dotted areas are their archers. I want to just read to you what historian David Fisher says about this. The English took up their position on a sloping ridge. Their knights dismounted and prepared to fight alongside the infantry. Interesting that at this time still, knights are dismounting to fight. They don't recognize the superiority of being on horseback. Armed with deadly longbows, the archers placed themselves slightly forward in wedges. In the center of the English line was a series of irrigation terraces that provided additional protection. The English also lined up a new weapon, the cannon. King Edward directed the battle from his headquarters in a nearby windmill. His troops readied themselves for the enemy attack. The French forces, however, were in chaos. 3 times as large as the English forces, the French army was poorly organized. The French king, Philip VI, was indecisive. Some of his advisors urged an immediate attack. Others advised waiting. According to one account of the battle, Philip ordered the attack, but then changed his mind. Unfortunately, by the time he had reconsidered, the army had started moving and could not be easily stopped. Also, many of the French knights, hungry for a battle with the English, disregarded the king's order to withdraw. The large but confused French army moved forward to confront the enemy. The first line of the French forces, mercenary crossbowmen from Genoa in Italy, surged up the hill. Before they ever reached the English, a shower of arrows, as one writer put it, fell like snow upon them. Trying to escape the feathered death of the arrows, the Genoese fell back. Now you can imagine that the longbow was a recent innovation by the English. It's called a longbow, not just because it's longer in length, but because it shoots further. And so the French have crossbows. You know what those are like. Those are like guns with arrows. Well, the distance that you can hit something with a crossbow is not very far. So you need to get in closer combat. But now the English with the longbows can attack an enemy from further away. And this is causing quite a problem for the French, or especially the Genoese mercenaries of France, because they're getting hit, but aren't close enough to hit back. So the Genoese are starting to retreat. Enraged, the French knights behind them slashed at the Genoese with their weapons and rode their horses, rode their horses directly over them toward the English. Some of the angry Genoese began firing their crossbows at the French. They're not letting them get away. The English longbows continued to pour down death upon the French. The longbow shot with greater accuracy and distance than any other kind of bow and could even pierce armor. Volley after volley from the English archers whistled through the air into the ranks of the French. The brave French charged on into the slaughter. Waves of knights swept up the slope only to die in the face of the staunch English defense. By the way, being on a slope too meant that, if you're on a hill shooting, you can shoot even further with the longbow. So you figure that how that would be. If you're in higher ground and you're shooting, you can make that arrow go further than it would be if you were just on flat ground. And so that's aiding the English as well. At one point, the French pressed in on the area commanded by the Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne. The prince sent a message to his father asking for reinforcements. From his windmill, King Edward answered, "Let the boy earn his spurs." In other words, no help coming. Let's see what you can do. The prince's forces fought on without reinforcements and drove the French back. The battle continued into the night. Finally, the weary French army fell back and melted away. King Philip fled the battlefield. The sun came up the next morning on corpses of thousands of French soldiers. The English lost at most only a few hundred. England had scored a decisive victory in her campaign for the French throne. Now, unfortunate losses of many battles, such as Crécy and Sluys, were due to a crisis and plague that struck during the reign of Philip VI. France was still a very divided country when he died. The next battle of importance is the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. At that battle, the English army was led by Edward's able son, Edward the Black Prince, the heir and first son of Edward II. Some think that his nickname may have come from his bad temper, but most likely it was from the color of his armor. The defeated King John II of France, son and heir of Philip VI, was captured and was detained for 4 years. During his imprisonment, an uprising of the lower class French occurred due to the economic hardship they were experiencing. The peasants burned castles, murdered and raped their lords and their wives, and attempted to reform the governmental system. At the same time, an assemblage of aristocrats attempted a takeover of power, restoring order by the massacre of the rebel peasants. So France, the King of France is having a hard time because, his country is falling apart at the same time that the English are invading. And then, of course, he gets captured. King John II, the French king, was ransomed and then signed the 1360 Treaty of Bretigny between England and France. It recognized Edward's claim to 25% of France, mostly in the north and southwest, in return for Edward III renouncing his claim to the French crown. The use of new tactics in conjunction with the new weapon longbows enabled the English to be hugely successful against the French crossbows, even though outnumbered. Longbows, as we said, were able to penetrate armor even, and were accurate at greater distances than previous weapons. And then the spread of the Black Death among the French helped the English as well. The Black Death at this point killed off a third of the population of France, further devastating the country. John, who had been captured, died in London in 1364. And you thought, wait a minute, I thought he was ransomed. Yeah, but then he volunteered to return as a hostage for some reason. And he died there. So he's followed by Charles V then of France. And this man strongly desired to get rid of the English from France's feudal territories. And so he ended the Treaty of Bretigny in 1369. He's also known as Charles the Wise. He avoided open battle, depending on the ability of his troops to harass the English and then retreat into their castles' safety. Frequently raiding the southeast coast of England with his superior navy, Charles V was able to gain back Aquitaine in 1372, and by 1375, the only lands left in France belonging to the English crown were Calais and a slice of Gascony. Charles VI then followed him. He was crowned in 1380 when he was only 11 years old. While he was ruling, France was under control of his uncle Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. Charles declared himself ruler in 1388, 4 years before he experienced his first bout of insanity. These bouts would occur every 3 to 5 months for the rest of his life. The Duke of Burgundy became regent again in 1392 due to the king's insanity, and a conflict broke out between him and the Duke of Orleans. A 2-decade truce was initiated on March 12, 1396, by the marriage of Richard II of England to Isabella, the daughter of Charles VI. Richard II was the grandson and heir of Edward III, since Edward the Black Prince, that we had seen before, had died of the plague a year before his father died. In 1380, Richard helped stop the peasants' revolt that took place in England. In 1385, he went to Scotland to face the Scottish and the French, but could not pressure them into a battle, and so he returned home. In the next few years, Richard began picking favorites and giving them higher pay and power. In 1386, a group of lords joined together to rebel against him as a result of his inept rule, and Richard gained control of them in 1397 and started ruling with total power, forcing subjects to live in fear. In 1399, after Richard II banned Henry from England, Henry Bolingbroke, from England for life and confiscating his estates, Henry then invaded England to steal the throne back from Richard. He captured Richard and claimed himself king. In 1400, Richard died in captivity under Henry Bolingbroke. The pause continued under the next king of England, who Henry Bolingbroke became Henry IV, as he was too occupied with rebellions in England and Wales to be concerned about France. Well, then Henry V comes to the throne of England at age 26, and he brought a serious reversal to the laissez-faire approach of the previous two regents, as he attempted to legitimize his reign in England and make himself the king of France, establishing an empire. Henry V was assisted in his endeavors by the descent into madness of Charles VI of France and the debilitating infighting amongst the French nobility. Henry invaded Normandy, scoring victories at the harbor of Harfleur and Agincourt. October 25th, 1415 is that last battle, and a lot of the French nobility were slaughtered there. By 1419, he had captured all of Normandy and became a national hero. The French were convinced to sign the Treaty of Troyes in May 1420, with Henry V nominated as regent and heir to Charles VI, marrying Charles VI's daughter, Catherine of Valois, to cement the deal. Henry had to promise to continue fighting against the now disinherited Dauphin Charles, and so continued the conflict. Henry V was never able to enjoy the fruits of his labors, as he died unexpectedly, probably of dysentery, August 31st, 1422, and was succeeded by his infant son, Henry VI. Looks like I got behind in my slides. There's Agincourt, and there's the Battle of Agincourt. Once again, the French are in red. They have archers, but the English, of course, have. No, I had that wrong. No, the French are in blue. The English are in red with their long bowmen, and the French have their crossbowmen once again. The English advanced, trying to provoke the French into coming into battle. And the French were taken by surprise. They rush into battle. But again, they can't handle the English archers, especially those that are out on the wings. The French get stuck in the mud. Still kept coming forward as the French main battle joined the fight. The Duke of York, the English, was killed. The Duke of Gloucester was wounded. Henry himself was hit. But the French were being slaughtered in huge numbers. They were broken, the French were, and they fled. Henry ordered the prisoners killed against all the customs of chivalry. So the defeat there cost France between 5,000 and 10,000 dead and captured, and including quite a few royals or nobles, I should say. English probably lost around 500 men. That brings us then to one of the most interesting elements of the 100 Years' War, and that is Joan of Arc. The peasant girl, Joan of Arc, attempted to unite the French troops behind the Dauphin, the future King Charles VII of France, to regain his birthright and unify all of France. Charles had acted as his insane father's regent in 1418, which was when he first experienced power. As a 13-year-old, while working in her father's garden, Joan had suddenly seen a bright light and heard a voice. The voice called her Joan the Maid and told her to live a virtuous life. Voices came more often and gave instructions. Joan was to save France and help the Dauphin to be crowned. In response to her questioning, the voices simply told Joan that God would be with her. Joan later identified the voices as belonging to the Archangel Michael and the saints Margaret of Antioch and Catherine of Alexandria. Now later, even though those latter two were pretty famous in the latter Middle Ages, historians later determined that the Margaret of Antioch and Catherine of Alexandria did not ever really exist. So Joan is hearing voices from non-existent people and an archangel. Might tell you something. Well, Joan, in order to try to convince the Dauphin to claim the throne and to fight against the English, traveled with 6 knights over 300 miles across enemy territory at night to tell the Dauphin her plans. Charles, the Dauphin, amusedly anticipated the girl's arrival by staging a trick. When Joan entered the 70-foot-long hall filled with 300 courtiers, the Dauphin was not on his throne. Instead, dressed like the others, he was mingled with the crowd. Somehow, Joan walked directly toward him and addressed him. "But I am not the Dauphin," he protested. "In God's name, gentle sire, you are," Joan responded. Then she revealed to him his private thoughts, proving that she was no ordinary maid. Believing that heavenly voices had directed her to drive the English out of France, she roused the weak French king to action, rallied the dispirited French troops, and accompanied the French army into battle. I mean, you can imagine what a revolutionary kind of thing that was. Women could not, I mean, the French had passed a law saying that a woman couldn't accede to the throne, or you couldn't even be a descendant of a woman, only as an inheritor of the throne. And here's this girl, this teenager, leading troops into battle. Her leadership and ability to inspire the Dauphin led to a lifting of a siege at Orleans in 1429, where she led the charge dressed in white armor and riding a white horse, and where she was also wounded by an arrow through her chest. The sight of her returning to battle inspired the troops to victory. Joan halted the fleeing enemy, halted the soldiers from pursuing the fleeing enemy, however. Why? Because this was Sunday. It was reserved for prayer. The troops, awed by their victory, gave up swearing and prostitutes. So she had a good effect on them. As well as a French victory at the Battle of Patay, where English archers were effectively surrounded by French cavalry. Her leadership led to a reacquiring of most of central France. This new development put England on the defensive, winning only a few victories, primarily through the aggressiveness of Sir John Talbot, the English Achilles. 19-year-old Joan was captured by the English after she had captured 8 towns in 8 days. French King Charles VII attempted no ransom. She was taken to England, where she was accused of sorcery, but condemned as a schismatic, which means a heretic. After a brief recantation, her fate was sealed with the pronouncement, "If I were to say that God sent me, I shall be condemned. But God really did send me." They said, "Okay, you're back to condemnation." And so she was publicly burned at the stake in the city of Rouen on May 30th, 1431, having knelt and prayed for her enemies, and then mounting the prepared pyre that would be set ablaze. We're told that as the flames leapt upward, Joan asked for a cross to be held before her. Gazing upon it, her final word was, "Jesus." Her example stirred the nation of France. Now let's just pause for a minute and discuss a little bit of what you think about Joan of Arc. What are your impressions of Joan? She's not only considered a national hero in France, but later on was declared to be a saint. And was vindicated, was acquitted of the charges against her, largely through the efforts of her mother, who continued to kind of badger the Roman Catholic Church to rectify her condemnation. So what do you think?
Sometimes it's a fine line between charisma and crazy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's the crazies that have the charisma. We think back through history, and a lot of crazy people gathered many to follow them. So was she crazy? That's a good question to consider. Was she crazy? Or what other explanation might there be for hearing voices? Feel afraid to say it.
Wouldn't be the first girl that God talked to, spoke to.
Yeah.
Or an angel.
Yeah, I think most every time I can think of that happening, though, it's not been God.
Right.
They thought God was talking to them, but it's actually demonic forces. So I think we're left with those two options. I don't think, it seems to me at least, that one of the options of explanation could not be that it was God talking to her. So that leaves me at least with two options. One, she was crazy and was just hearing voices, or she was being directed by demonic spirits. Would you agree that those are the two likeliest possibilities, or do you have a third, or does someone want to argue for that God was really directing her in this?
Well, you already said that she attributed some other voices to people that didn't even exist.
Yeah.
So that kind of weighs in on the crazy side. In my mind.
I don't think that eliminates the demonic, because demons do have and do often imitate people that either are dead or people that those to whom they are appearing think are people that are dead.
She'd just be making it all up.
Or that's the third
Just-
possibility.
just-
She just made it
Just
all up.
lying so that she could use it as a power play to say she's having these things. And
Yeah. I mean, she is a teenage girl.
Yeah.
They make up stuff sometimes.
Right. Because you can't refute someone's experience, and so now
Yeah.
you can kind of.
Yeah.
Use that as a power.
Yeah, but the death that she received kind of goes against that, because if you die for something you made up.
That's true.
Yeah.
Good thought, yeah.
Say, I'm sorry, I just made it all up.
Yeah, she-
Bad,
That's
that's
right.
right.
That's-
She was committed.
Yeah. Yeah. And she seemed to really believe that what she was doing was for God, you know, so her last words were Jesus. That's the cross there. Yeah.
You think you'll see her in heaven?
I don't anticipate it myself.
Part of those crazy mystic kind
Yeah.
of stuff.
Yeah, because remember, we talked before about how mysticism was very popular. We looked before at Catherine of Siena, who was a mystic and had revelations from God. And how at a time when people didn't have God's word to rely on and didn't have a church that was teaching them God's word, that people who claimed to have a connection to God through their mystic experiences were very revered. Although the Dauphine seems to have vacillated at best with Joan. You know, she's trying to get him to, get up, be a man, get up and fight. And he's going, I don't know. And, okay, you go ahead, you lead the soldiers out. And then later, and then she's captured. He said, Joan, who? So.
Well, things were pretty bleak then. I mean, any port in a storm, she was, at least had some leadership ability.
Yeah. And if nothing, follow somebody who's confident. Rally around. And wearing white armor on a white horse, that helps too. I've never seen any pictures of her like that, but I probably saw it. There was somebody's done it. Most of them look like this one. And there's just a picture of there's this famous statue of her. I don't remember if it's in Paris or where. But once she got back into the good graces of the church. Well, let's not belabor Joan too much. Let's continue with the end of the war. Skip ahead there. The French continued to advance through superior numbers, marriage alliances, and determination, taking advantage of England's bankruptcy, England's own civil conflicts, and the bouts of insanity experienced by Henry VI. You might wonder at all the insanity that's going on, but you've got royal families that are doing a lot of intermarrying. So insanity is one of the byproducts of the kind of genetic defects that occur when you're constantly intermarrying in the same families. Henry VI was finally murdered in the Tower of London decades later in May 1471. By the way, let me just use this as a side note. Anytime through history, in English history, you find the Tower of London mentioned many times. Somebody being sent to the Tower of London. I always thought that was an actual tower. It's like Rapunzel's tower, Oh, you go to the tower, you're stuck in that tower and you can't get out of that tower unless you have really long hair. Are you with me on that? All right, does anybody know the real Tower of London? Which I thought to put a picture in here. We saw it when we were in England. It's a huge castle-like area. It is not just a tower. It is a large walled-off area that was the home of several kings, and being sent there was not being sent to a room at the top of a tall spire. You might have had some luxurious rooms there. The crown jewels are still kept there in the Tower of London. So anyway, that's where he was murdered. Have to find the word. So then Francis, King Charles VII captured Bordeaux in the southwest, ending essentially the 100 Years' War. At the same time, somewhere else, the city of Constantinople. Remember where that is? Today's called Istanbul. Well, this is when that begins. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. So all this is, you think all this is going on in England and France, and nobody's watching what's going on in Constantinople. We're past the Crusades. Not a lot past. I mean, we talked about the Crusades a long time ago, but some of them come up close to this time. But there's so much infighting in Europe that Constantinople is not even a consideration, and they allow the Muslims to take over, and they've mostly had it ever since. Well, considering, oops, went the wrong way. And that's looking back at, I must have been behind the slide. Regions loyal to Charles VII. And again, the Duchy of the English King down there in the lower left, that's part of Aquitaine, still hanging on to that. Essentially, looking at this war, and we say the French kind of won, but in reality, there were no winners. English resources were drained by decades of constant conflict. For the French, political unrest at home decreased their zeal for fighting a foreign war. In addition to the losses incurred by the French, another reason for the discontent was Philip's attempt to fix prices, which was due to the decreased labor force, which was brought about by the ravages of both war and the Black Death. Remember back when we talked about the plague and the effect it had on the economy of all these people dying. There are not enough laborers anymore to perform the work, and how that should have resulted in higher wages, supply and demand. And that would have encouraged people to get into labor in certain industries. But there was an attempt to fix the wages, fix prices of things. And all that leads to is still not having enough laborers and not having enough products. It doesn't help to do that. It's been tried many, many times, including in this country. One of the worst things that President Richard Nixon did that showed his true colors. I always thought he was a conservative, but he did a lot of things that indicated that he was not conservative. And one of them was that you may remember when he initiated wage and price freeze. How many of you remember that? Come on, some of you are roles on it. It was sorry. Trying to remember when it was exactly. But from that point on, you were not allowed to increase wages of anybody, and it was his way of trying to stop inflation. Listen, inflation, prices are going up. Well, the government just says, well, can't raise prices anymore. That solves it, right? Wrong. So what happens instead? You're going to get a quick economics lesson here. What happens if you're producing a product and you can't raise the price on it, even though your prices have gone up in the past, but now you're trying to catch up with that, but now you can't raise your prices. What do you do?
Did you go out of business?
You go out of business, one thing, which means more people out of work. Or if you're producing a product, you just make it smaller. You gone to the grocery store and you see that packages are smaller than they used to be? Well, they know there's only so high a price you will pay for stuff, but if they can give you less of it and you don't really notice it, then you're paying a higher price. I remember when candy bars went from a certain size and shrunk down. You know, that was inflation. They didn't want to raise the price or couldn't raise the price. So any government interference in an economy always has bad effects. And this was an attempt back then. Let's see. So I gotta find my place now. The unrest then that came about as a result of Philip's attempts to fix prices was further exacerbated by Philip's marriage to his son's fiancée. That didn't go over too well either. Suffering defeat after defeat and the destruction of their countryside humiliated the French. So even though they won the war, a lot of negatives. But in a sense, the loser wins. A surge of French nationalism inspired by Joan of Arc resulted in the French actually winning the war, even though they had lost most of the battles. The French gained all of the land of France except Calais, as you saw in the video. Now, the consequences in England. Okay, let's see, we talked about all that. In England, it was a blessing in disguise because efforts in England, they're under the attention of the English, turn inward to the nation instead of outward to French possessions. So in other words, losing all those French possessions, they finally came to realize, hey, let's concentrate on what we've got and who we are instead of always trying to get something else. Always trying to get the French, and always trying our king to be the king of France. Let's just be the king of England and recognize that we're in this island nation and let's concentrate on what we're doing here. Unfortunately, one of the things that resulted from that was a civil war, which we know as the Wars of the Roses. So the loss of the war for England caused a lot of nobles to question the monarch, his right to rule. Henry VI had begun to experience bouts of mental illness. This and the inevitable search for scapegoats for what had happened in France ultimately led to the dynastic disputes known today as the War of the Roses. English troops returned not to peace but to civil war between the rival families of York, symbolized by, anybody know the color rose? The Yorks. Do you know the two choices? White rose for the Yorks, and Lancaster, the red rose, each of them vying for the throne. After 30 years of conflict, Henry Tudor defeated Richard II at the Battle of Bosworth Field, which resulted in the victor being crowned as King Henry VII. You can see where we're headed. In France, nationalism stirred by the English presence in France strengthened the authority of French kings. French victory increased this power. The power of the French kings was also enhanced by the royal land tax, which was allowed by the Estates General in order to combat the death and destruction brought on by the English. That any subsequent taxes did not need the consent of the Estates General, boosted the monarch's control even more. So the king now has become more powerful. All right, any questions about the 100 Years' War? We actually made it a little over an hour. I know a lot of confusing people and stuff, but I hope you at least see the way history is going at this point. One of the major things that are happening that are moving toward, in this case, France and England viewing themselves as separate nations, and the effect that's going to have on what occurs in the future. Any of you interested in Spain? Nobody? Well, whether you are or not, next time we're gonna find out how Spain got to be Spain. And
Getting
it's gonna be a shorter story.
Columbus, those guys.
Yeah, so it's gonna be important for what's happening with exploration. And then we'll also look at the disunity of Italy and Germany, how they're all broken up too. So, any final questions or comments?
Just you mentioned about how everybody's related to everybody, that's still true today. Right, because the new Denmark guy that just was crowned today
Oh,
is related to King Charles, to Queen Victoria, they're cousins. So, with a good BBC website, you read about it, you know, they're talking about how. they're
because it's important to the BBC
Exactly,
to make all those connections.
you know,
In fact, we get to World War I, some have called it a family dispute because the leaders of all the different countries fighting World War I are related to one another.
You see that picture of the Tsar being next to each other with the brothers?
Oh, no, I've never
Oh,
seen
it's
this.
amazing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, they were related. Make sure you tune into Discovering His Story. I just finished 4 episodes on the Assyrian Empire, didn't finish with the Assyrians yet. They played a very important role in the nations of Israel and Judah. But go back and see some of the archived episodes from the beginning of creation on up through the divided kingdom. I think it's about 28 episodes. YCTV.org.
King George and South Russia.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
Brothers.
Yeah. and they were apparently appeared together
Yeah.
for this, right?
Well, if I remember correctly, the Tsar wanted to get, they wanted to come to England for renovation was going on.
Uh-huh.
And they denied him, you know, for political purposes, and he ended up dying, you know.
Oh, yeah, he was
Yeah,
killed.
it's-
Yeah.
Yeah, but get it. No, I think that's definitely.